Today, we will explore when and how it will be implemented, and we'll have a thorough look at all the economic and legal questions and to see what changes need and can be foreseen. I have to mention that this webinar is the third in a series of 6 webinars dedicated to business leaders operating in Africa around the consequences of Covid-19. And this series is organized, of course, by the Africa CEO Forum in partnership with the international law firm Asafo & Co. So before entering in the heart of the subject, I have to do a little bit of practical information. Please remember that you have the opportunity to ask questions in the Q&A section. There's a little tab at the bottom of your screen. Please, I encourage you to make full use of it. And for this webinar, it is really an interactive experience that we are giving you. So ask your questions, but also comment, please. And we'll make sure to bring those to our speakers. Also, during this conference, a couple of polls will be brought to you, so feel free to vote. I'll ask the question first, and then a few minutes later, I'll give you the answers to your polls. And also, of course, if you have any problems, please mention it in the Q&A section. Our team will be more than happy to bring the solutions to your issues. And of course, feel free to live tweet about this event, about the interview, very big and exclusive interview that we are bringing to you using the hashtag ACF Digital Events. That's hashtag ACF Digital Events. Thank you very much for this. So the question here today is, can the AFCFTA be the response to the crisis that the continent needs today? This is indeed the perfect time to ask this question. With an expected $3.4 trillion in wealth creation, with 1.3 billion people across Africa, and a targeted objective of 50% intra-African trade by 2030, the African Continental Free Trade Area is a source of considerable, amazing hope for the private sector in our continent. And indeed, it is a much needed stimulus package for Africa. And however, as you have noticed, it's still lagging. It is the world's greatest free trade zone, and it was due, as you know, to come into full force by July the 1st, but it's been postponed, and this is why we are here today. And as a reminder, to date, around 30 African countries have signed in its favor. And we have the opportunity today to be speaking with Wamkele Mene, the very first Secretary General of the AFCFTA. And with him, we'll have a chance to get a better understanding at why these delays are happening. And also, of course, and that's where we want the emphasis to be, we'll be looking at the full potential that this trade area will bring to Africa. I have to let you know as well that this discussion will last around 30 minutes. And straight after that, we'll move into our panels with our estimated speakers today. We'll be in the company of Maher, Jarmakani, CEO of Jagal in Lagos. In Casablanca, we'll be with Karim Tazi, administrator at Richbond, for perspectives from the private sector, which is really what we want to find out today. And for legal matters, we'll be in the company of Nani Mungai in Nairobi. Mr. Mungai is senior partner at MMC Asafo. Following this, we'll also have 2 presentations from Thierry Lacroix in Paris. Mr. Lacroix is Managing Director Africa at one point, and Mrs. Gomolemo Kekesi in Johannesburg. Mrs. Kekesi is Director at Asafo and Lawtons. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I now turn to the Secretary General of the AFCFTA, Mr. Wamkele Mene. Mr. Mene, please be welcome to this webinar.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I look forward to the conversation with you.
Well, we're the one thanking you. In fact, it's a great honor to have you agreeing to be in our company today, and indeed to address the Africa private sector. This is a great opportunity to get clear answers for you. Mm-hmm. Mr. Mene, the implementation of the agreement has been delayed after a recommendation by you to the heads of states in the context, of course, of the COVID pandemic. Can you please explain to us why you have made this recommendation, and indeed, how have the head of states responded to your request?
Well, again, thank you very much for inviting me. We were scheduled to start trading under the rules of the agreement on the 1st of July this year. But as you know, out of 55 countries, 42 countries in Africa are either in a full lockdown or a partial lockdown. We have border closures in place. No trading is taking place at all, not even in many cases, not even in the area of trade-in services. And so really the conditions are not conducive for us to say that credibly that we are trading when we know that goods are not transmitting through the borders. Second, it is our view that the priority at this moment for governments across, not only across the world, but in Africa, governments should be given the space to focus on fighting the pandemic, on saving the lives of Africans, so that we are able to defeat the pandemic and resume our work in terms of trade at the right time that is to be determined by the heads of states. And so our view was that it would not be credible for us to say we're trading on the 1st of July when we know that in some cases there are trucks that are lined up at borders up to 40, 50 kilometers that are not able to transit goods through the borders because of the border closures. And so in that context, it's not a credible thing to say we are trading. So really, it was a consideration of practical effects on the ground, but also, and more importantly, the need for governments to be given the space to fight the pandemic and deal with the public health crisis.
But Mr. Mene, it seems that not everyone was in favor of this postponement. So what was it that really tipped the scales for you? What was the overriding factor?
Well, my responsibility is to advise the Assembly of Heads of States of the African Union to make decisions that again, I wish to emphasize that will be supported by facts on the ground. Mm-hmm. I don't think that we should advise our heads of states to do something that all of us know is not possible. For example, Africa's trade to the rest of the world is over 53%. That number is set to decline this year by up to 30%. We are to see a decline of our exports by up to 30% because the borders all over the world are closed. And so I mention this because it would not have been credible to say that we are trading when export numbers are declining all over the world, not just for Africa. So the decision, of course, is not mine. I made a recommendation. The heads of states, it is up to them to accept the decision. But really looking at the facts on the ground and looking at what is happening with border closures, it simply was not possible for us to proceed on that basis. The second reason, of course, is that the negotiations were not fully concluded. So we lost the month of March, the month of April, which would have enabled us to be ready for the 1st of July, but those engagements were cancelled because of the onset of the pandemic. And so these are the reasons why we thought that it was important that a postponement should be considered. I should say, however, that there was wide consultation by the heads of states on the recommendations that we made, wide consultations with private sector, with other heads of states in Africa, and ultimately it was decided that perhaps we should postpone to a date that they will determine.
So we'll go, Mr. Mene, more into details in a little while as to those negotiations and what are still the blocks that need to be sorted out. But the burning question here, which I'm sure all our CEOs are burning to find out, is when will the trade area come into effect? Can you give us some indication on how long this will take?
Well, we would like to resume our work and start trading as soon as possible, as soon as the conditions, the public health conditions, as soon as they allow for us to resume. And of course, as soon as the borders are reopened and the lockdown measures are rescinded that have been imposed in many, many countries in Africa. We have made a recommendation to the heads of states to say we would like this to happen as soon as possible in the next 6 months, again, subject to the pandemic itself. If the pandemic is defeated at that time, of course, that would be the best scenario for us to be in. But we hope that the heads of states will direct that we start trading by the 1st of January next year. And we hope that the heads of states will direct that we conclude all our work by the end of this year to enable trading to take place very, very early next year. That is what we hope for. And again, I must emphasize, of course, it depends on the path of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. So January 2021, this is your deadline. This is the deadline, the target that you hope you'll be reaching. Can we hope for that, do you reckon?
I think we can hope for the 1st of January 2020 if the pandemic is defeated, or at least if the conditions are conducive. And second, where we conclude the technical work that is outstanding, which enables for us to have a package on the table, a package on rules of origin, a package on tariff reductions, and all of these components are the things that are required for trading to take place across regions in Africa. So that is our hope.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Mr. Mene, preparing this interview, I talked to various African CEOs all across the continent in our network, and some indeed were very disappointed with this postponement and even expressed doubts as to whether DFCTA will ever come into action one day. Are you worried that this delay will further increase their doubts? And did you take that factor of confidence into account when you recommended this postponement?
Well, I understand the concerns about the postponement, and I understand the anxiety.
Many of them are following us today, so I'm sure they're looking forward to your answer.
Yes, I absolutely understand the concern. I understand the anxiety that it creates, and I understand the uncertainty that the postponement creates. But as I said earlier, the primary focus for governments at this time must be to fight the pandemic and to ensure that public health and people's lives are saved. This is, for me, the priority. And even when you look at governments across Africa, the ministers of trade themselves are engaged in finding solutions to how do we actually save our small, medium enterprises from being destroyed by some of the lockdown measures that are necessary. So even the ministers that we require to support the work that we do are elsewhere engaged in fighting the pandemic. That's the first point. The second point, of course, as I said, the borders are closed. What we have done is to work with the Africa Center for Disease Control to compile a list of essential products that we propose should transit through borders whilst the borders are closed. These essential products should be allowed to transit through the borders to enable millions and millions of Africans to have access to germ-killing products, to soaps and so on. So that has been our priority at this time. But I don't think that we should be concerned that there is now a lack of political will. We should not be concerned that there is now a lack of political commitment. Our political will, the heads of states, the ministers, the political will is not diminished. The political commitment is not diminished to implement this agreement. On the contrary, I should point out, we recognize that Africa's, and I've been saying this for the last 2 to 3 months, we recognize fully that Africa's economic recovery is actually implementation of this AFCFTA. We don't have $1 trillion in a stimulus package to provide and to re-inject growth into our economies like some countries have. We don't have $60 billion to give to our airline industry to save our airline industry from collapse during the time of the pandemic. And so for us, the recovery, the driver of the recovery post-COVID-19 to enable Africa to get back to having 6 out of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world being African, it is implementation of this agreement. And so I think what I would take this opportunity to reassure all Africans, small, medium enterprises, corporate, multinational corporations, that we shall implement the agreement. The political will is there. The political commitment is there. However, we really had to take account of conditions on the ground. And by so doing, I think it must also be understood that part of my job is to make sure that the decisions that the heads of states take are decisions that are based on fact, that are based on science, and that are based on data. And when you look at all these factors, all of these factors were really leading to one direction, that it is not possible for us to commence trading on the 1st of July this year as we had intended.
Mm-hmm. So we understand really the real potential of the AFCFTA, but can you say that it is somehow going against the global trend at the moment? Because indeed we've seen that this crisis has compelled many countries, including on the continent, to adopt very protectionist measures to boost their agricultural sector, to create a more sustainable manufacturing environment. So what do you say to that?
Well, we have done something as Africans that you are right at the initial part of your comment. We have done something that has been going against the global trend. And so as we have seen tariffs increasing around the world, we as Africans under this agreement are reducing tariffs. As we have seen trade and investment protectionism rising around the world, we as Africans have been reducing barriers to trade and investment in Africa. The second point I would make is that we know, of course, that we have a number of challenges. First, Africa's industrial base, which is very, very narrow, Africa's manufacturing capacity, and Africa's intra-trade capacity are all very, very significant challenges. But we needed to lay the basis to overcome market fragmentation, to overcome the lack of an industrial base. We needed to establish the legal framework. And this is what this agreement has enabled us to do. So we will now, leveraging on this agreement, we will now be able to establish regional value chains, centers of manufacturing excellence across the African continent. And we will be able to start our work of ensuring that we place Africa, all African countries, big and small, we place Africa on a path to industrial development where we manufacture value-added goods. Again, leveraging on the agreement, which is intended to reduce tariffs, to reduce regulatory barriers to trade in goods in Africa. Similarly, just by way of concluding on this point, similarly, in the area of trade in services, we will also reduce barriers there to trade in services, so that there is a harmonization of rules, a harmonization of regulations, for financial services, for telecommunication services. So I mention these examples because the sum total should lead to the conclusion that as the world is moving, as the rest of the world is moving, it appears, towards trade and investment protectionism, as Africa, we are reducing barriers to trade and investment in Africa.
So indeed, this sounds like a wonderful opportunity to put our continent in the right track, in the fast track for industrialization. Talking about tariffs, this is such a major issue, and I'm sure that so many people are looking for clear answers. Can you please give us an idea of how many products are still at stake to be agreed on? We know that we still have blockages as regards to this. So how many products still need to be agreed on? In what sector? If you could please mention that as well. And also, do you have like a target number of how many products you would like to agree on, please?
Well, the target number is that, which was agreed a few years ago, is that we reduce barriers to trade, to intra-Africa trade in terms of tariffs, up to 97% of the country's, what we call a tariff book. So up to 97% of your the sectors in your goods trading should be liberalized by year 15. The duty should be at zero. Now, what is attendant to that, because in Africa the problem is not so much high tariffs, but the problems is the behind the border measures, the regulations, the non-tariff barriers that we're also targeting. Whilst we deal with the 97% that has to come to zero by a certain period of time. At the moment, it's very difficult to say which sectors will be in, which sectors will be out, because each region and each country has the prerogative to decide which sectors it will liberalize first, which goods it will liberalize first. And this is the negotiation that would have happened in March and in April. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. So it's very difficult to predict what each region, whether ECOWAS will say this or whether SACU will say that. Suffice to say that we have a target, and that is to reduce in 97% of trade, to reduce tariffs to zero by a certain period of time. And that period of time has been agreed to, and the percentage of tariff reduction has also been agreed to, and the modalities have been agreed to. What was left was for countries and regions to negotiate within those parameters that were already agreed to.
Mm-hmm. Mr. the Secretary General, this is quite a specific question again. So to be functional and efficient, of course, the CFTA needs a secretariat with a budget large enough to run a successful administration. Can you please tell us whether the budget is there and how many people are currently working in this department, please?
Well, we have a budget we have a number of sources of budget. One is the African Union, the overall budget of the African Union, the member states. I'm very, very grateful for the support of Afrexim Bank that has provided a substantial amount of budget support. I'm also very grateful to the African Development Bank that has similarly provided an equally significant budget support for implementation and establishment of the Secretariat. We are now in the process of, as I sit talking to you today in Addis Ababa, we are in the process of recruiting key personnel. And the type of people that we want in the Secretariat are the brightest and the best Africans. The brightest and the best trade lawyers, the brightest and the best trade economists, who will make sure that the implementation of this agreement is a success. So our budget for us to implement the agreement and to assist member states to implement the agreement, the budget support is there, both, as I said, from the African Union, but also, most critically, from Afrexim Bank and the African Development Bank, who share our objectives for boosting intra-Africa trade.
So you're confident that you have all the resources that you need to implement the AFCFTA successfully?
Well, we have all the resources that we have requested for today in order to ensure that we run our programs for 2020. We will, of course, request more resources for the year 2021 and going forward. So we have been very fortunate, as I say, to receive a lot of support. And I personally have written letters to both Afrexim Bank and AFDB to thank them and appreciate the support. We welcome, of course, support from private sector. In time when I am fully operational in Accra, where I am supposed to be, we will establish a private sector dialogue. And I look forward to the private sector engaging with us. So not only for program support, but also to assist us to better understand how the private sector can benefit from this agreement and the types of things that we need to do as the Secretariat to facilitate participation of small, medium enterprises, young Africans in trade, women in trade, and of course, the participation of African multinational corporations in the implementation of this agreement.
Mm-hmm. Well, indeed, Mr. Secretary General, you are showing us today that you are very open to discussing with our private sector today. And ahead of our discussion, we have asked our participants to ask questions directly to you. And I have a couple of them here. So the first one is from Nkem Iwajoku, who's managing director at First Line. And he's asking whether the digital solutions will facilitate free trade in the future and how?
Well, I think that's a great question. When you look at what is driving some of the drivers of Africa's services sector, it is digital enabled trade, not just e-commerce, but digitization in general, digitization of trade in general is absolutely critical. So we are going to establish a digital trade platform, which we intend to, whose objective must be to ensure that as we roll out and implement the agreement, we have efficient trading systems in place. For example, it is possible for us to digitize our customs procedures to make trade more efficient amongst African countries. At the moment, if you are sending goods from one part of Africa to the other, there is what is called rules of origin. It has to be verified. You get a manual certificate and so on. All of these customs procedures can be digitized to make sure that we make trade in Africa more efficient and more affordable. The second reason why it's very, very important is because we know from empirical evidence that small, medium enterprises, particularly in countries along the border, small, medium enterprises, informal traders, use digitally enabled platforms to access markets in other parts of Africa, or to make an assessment of markets in other parts of the Africa before they send their goods. And so our job really in this context is to make sure that we lay the regulatory framework for digitization of trade in Africa, for digitization, the regulatory framework for e-commerce in Africa to take place for small, medium enterprises, for multinational corporations. The last point I would make in this regard is we know that some of the drivers of innovation in digital platforms trading are young Africans. If you go to Kigali, you go to Lagos, you will find that young Africans who are innovating in this area of digitization and e-commerce. And so we have to provide the necessary platforms and the regulatory frameworks for these young innovators to be, yet again, as I say, to be involved in the implementation of this agreement. So digitization of our trade is really, if we're talking about the fourth industrial revolution, we have got to be thinking ahead in terms of how we respond from a trade point of view. How do we respond to digitization of trade? And I think it's a very important point.
Mm-hmm. And indeed, and with this pandemic, we've seen such a boom in creativity all around our continent with real digital hubs, whether it's in Cameroon, in Morocco, in Kenya, South Africa. And so I'm sure that everyone will be very glad to know that you will be supporting this trend. I now have two more questions before letting you go, Mr. Mene, please. The next one is coming from Mr. Guy Bangé, Chairman of the Board of Afriland First Bank in Côte d'Ivoire, and he's asking you whether the future of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, a United States Trade Act, of course, AGOA, whether the AGOA with Africa, whether this future will impact on the implementation of the AFCFTA. Will this have any impact at all?
Well, AGOA expires in 2025. And we know from the last engagement with the US that the US is interested in a trading arrangement with Africa, whether it is individual countries or Africa as a bloc, as a region. That interest was expressed at the last AGOA forum. What I would say is this: it is very important that we conclude and consolidate our own regional integration effort. It's very important that we conclude our own market integration effort, our own investment regulatory framework integration effort, that we conclude all of that work before we can say that we are in a position to engage with third parties, whether it is the US or whoever the other third party may be. And this is the point that the heads of states made at the Assembly of Heads of States in January this year. The point was that, yes, we recognize that there are third parties who have an interest in negotiating with us, but we need to consolidate our market integration and regional integration efforts first. So we need to conclude the negotiations of the AFCFTA. We have to conclude and consolidate its implementation at the level of member states, so that we are in a position of strength to negotiate, and also so that we are in a position where we negotiate from a common regulatory and legal framework. It's very difficult to predict at this point whether the African Union and member states of the African Union will decide to negotiate a post-AGOA arrangement either as individuals or as a bloc. That is a decision that each country will make, and I'm sure it will be communicated to the African Union at the right time. But I think the critical point to make is that if we are to integrate ourselves into the global economy as Africa, and if we are to enter global value chains as Africa, it's important that we first leverage this AFCFTA amongst ourselves so that we can engage with other parties as we go forward beyond 2025.
And one last question, please, Mr. Mene. As you know, many high-level African CEOs are with us today, and we'll watch the replay of our interview on our website and on different platforms in the coming days. And as you might be aware, some of them are still in doubt as to whether the AFCFTA will be of benefit to them. Do you have a message for them?
I absolutely do have a message for them. When we started this process, there were some doubters who said the agreement, the negotiations will never be concluded. The agreement will never be signed. It was signed by 54 out of 55 countries. Then they said it will never be ratified. It's been ratified by 28 countries. There are more ratifications that are coming. Now we're hearing that it will never be implemented. Well, nobody could have anticipated COVID-19. So I want to reassure all Africans, whether you are a CEO or not, the political commitment remains, the political will remains, the legal obligation remains. We shall do it as Africans. We shall implement this agreement. It may not be in the manner in which we were hoping, which was from the 1st of July. But as I said, nobody would have anticipated that COVID-19 would cause so much disruption in Africa and across the world, of course. But as I said, we should look at COVID-19 and the disruption it has caused as an opportunity to do a number of things. One, to redouble our efforts at improving Africa's industrial development capacity, establishing value chains across the African continent. And number two, we should see it as an opportunity so that we are less reliant on global supply chains as Africans. If we develop our own regional value chains and industrial development. And the second point, it's an opportunity for us to relook at our intellectual property regime and to make an assessment of the extent to which our intellectual property regime is at the service of Africa's public health objectives, and whether or not our intellectual property regime is at the service of Africa's industrial development capacity. And here I'm talking in the sense of production of generic drugs, so establishment of a manufacturing capacity for generic drug industry, which is hinged on intellectual property rights regime. And so this is my message, that the commitment absolutely remains. And we are all fully conscious of the fact that in order for Africa to recover from this pandemic, in order for Africa to once again register year-on-year growth, we need to implement the agreement, and we need to implement it as a matter of urgency.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mene. I have to thank you for having been so thorough and very clear in your answers here. I'm sure that all of us who are following you today would have better understood the mechanisms and why this delay and what is blocking, but also all the potential that the AfCFTA will have to offer our private sector. Thank you once again for your presence with us today. Thank you. And I want to thank all of you as well, participants. I have to remind you that you can comment on Twitter and other social platforms using the hashtag that you can see on your screens right now, ACF Digital Events. I thoroughly encourage you to do so, as we are very, very keen to have you participate in the conversation. So as you've heard, Mr. Mene, the first Secretary General of the AfCFTA, has declared that there is now a target of January 2021 for this trade area to come into effect, and we will for sure follow this through and with great interest. So without further ado, it is now my pleasure to open the floor to our other keynote speaker, who will be giving us a great introduction. His name is Thierry Lacroix, and he's Managing Director Africa at OnePoint. Mr. Lacroix's main areas of focus are strategy, business development, sales, and communication and marketing. And prior to this, he was a strategy consultant for a locally based Senegalese consulting firm. So I would like you all to welcome Mr. Lacroix. Soyez le bienvenu.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie.
Right? And I leave the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. It's a pleasure to be reunited with the Africa SEO Forum family. And Mr. Mene, after a half-hour interview, just confirmed that he has one of the most exciting yet challenging job for the next 4 years in Africa, which means bringing together 54 sovereign states with their geographic, economic, social, language, and cultural diversity to implement a common vision, which is an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa enshrined in Agenda 2063 of the African Union. This also means that he has to embody the voice of the continent internationally. But let's take a step back and for the sake of our audience, remind ourselves of some of the key data and figures of this historic initiative. It all began in January 2012, where heads of state and government of the African Union adopted the decision to establish a Continental Free Trade Area. It was signed in March 2018, entered into force in May 2019 for the 24 countries that had deposited their instruments of ratification. And the operational phase was subsequently launched in July 2019. So to date, in just over 8 years, and we have to keep this in mind, is 30 countries have both signed, and Mr. Mene is saying between 28 and more are coming, have signed and approved ratification of this agreement. And out of the 55 AU member states, only Eritrea has yet to sign. So once implemented, it will comprise of several legal instruments that cover trade in goods, trade in services, and dispute settlement. And this phase will be phase 1, which entered into force on May 1st. And then we'll have a second phase for investments, legal instruments, competition policy, and as Mr. Mene was talking about, the very important and crucial intellectual property rights also. So as a reminder, it will also be governed by 5 operational instruments: the rules of origin, we talked a lot about it, the online negotiation portal, the monitoring and elimination of non-tariff barriers, a digital payment system, and the African Trade Observatory. So the continent's most ambitious integration initiative today has clear goals and guiding principles. In the agreement itself, it highlighted 8 general objectives with 3 key ones. The main one being to create a single continental market for goods and services, of course, with free movements of business persons and investments. And as Mr. Muchanga, the African Union's Commissioner for Trade and Industry, recently stated, the agreement should end the era of balkanization and fragmentation. And Mr. Mene said it again a couple of minutes ago. Second thing was to expand intra-African trade across the regional economic communities and the continent in general. According to the IMF, once implemented, and you said it, Anne-Marie, before, the agreement could boost intra-Africa trade by 15 to 25% in the medium term and create a unified economic bloc worth $3.4 trillion, encompassing 1.3 billion people, making it, as such, the biggest commercial bloc since WTO's creation in 1994. Third thing was to enhance competitiveness and support economic transformation. But during his acceptance speech, Mr. Mene also stressed the importance to ensure that the IFCFTA should trigger shared and inclusive economic growth. That means bringing the question of equitable distribution of its gains at the center of its implementation. And this means, as he said, and he said it again a couple of minutes ago, making sure the agreement benefits not just a handful of industrialized African countries, the usual suspects, not just the top 500 African multinationals, but also making sure it empowers women, young Africans, and SMEs more specifically. And look, it's true. I mean, integration has been one of the hot topics of most of my conversations over the years with Africa's private sector CEOs. The agreement should benefit the women and men who relentlessly contribute to Africa's growth, to Africa's innovation, transformation, and soft power. However, the many discussions I have had with African CEOs also highlighted 2 constraints. And maybe we'll talk about it a little later, but how to better make the private sector part of the discussion and how to better communicate on the sometimes very technical aspects and details of the negotiations to the private sector, which again will be the first one to be impacted. Then the COVID happened, and Mr. Mene talked about it for a while. But even before the current COVID situation, let's remind ourselves that the intra-Africa trade rate had been for long a major issue, between 15 to 18%, I said. But also let's look at the bright side, and as Carlos Lopez stated not too long ago, well, progress have been made over the years, and we have to keep this in mind. Since COVID, 30 states have closed their borders. Mr. Mene just also said that 42 of them are in half or full lockdown. We can also add that this triggers that, according to a recent article in the Brookings Institute, some even argued that the contraction of Africa's GDP could be from 7.9 to even 12.3 percentage points, which is way more than what the IMF stated of 4.7 percentage point contraction for sub-Saharan Africa. Finally, Mr. Adesina also said that the financing deficit of Africa has just risen by $154 billion. However, this world pandemic, and you said it before, it could also be seen as a unique opportunity to put together this. You talked about a stimulus package that Africa crucially needs to transform its economy. It's to reconfigure Africa's supply chain. Mr. Mene was talking about it, through a higher reliance on regional value chains. It's also an opportunity to rethink and reshape the African economic model, to build a sovereign Africa economically, financially, in terms of education, food security, health, and digitalization, to welcome the new industrial revolution driven by data, by new technologies, e-commerce, of course, new experiences and places for customers and citizens, smart and wise cities and territories, digital trade, etc. So the agreement needs to take it into account, and Mr. Mene highlighted it again during the interview. So there has been a lot of debates around this agreement. However, I think very few of them were, about its relevance or objective or benefits. They were mainly around its timeline, implementation, and information. So again, the COVID pandemic has shown the rest of the world how resilient, innovative, reactive the continent is in face of such a global shock. But it's also demonstrated the crucial implementation of a unified response. And this may be the opportunity for leaders to speed up the remaining negotiations. What are they? We touched point on some of them. Some outstanding issues remain. We have to complete the negotiations, as Mr. Mene explained, especially on tariffs, on rules of origin. For trade and services, you have to conclude the negotiations on sector-specific commitments. They now have another 6 months to finalize some detailed, specific, and very technical aspects of these negotiations before hopefully a launch on June 1st. It is also clear that the monitoring and reporting will be just as crucial as the agreement itself. Mr. Mene said it, Mr. Muchanga also, that behind the scenes might be some non-tariff barriers also. So you can not only look at the 97% that Mr. Mene was talking about. Given the timing, the current situation, and the financial constraints, this is one question for maybe the panel afterwards, what would or should be the priorities in the next few months and few years of its commitment? So let me finish by congratulating Mr. Mene for his election. Wish him the best for his leadership. I'm sure I can speak on behalf of everyone by saying that we will all work with him to achieve this great vision of Pan-African inclusive integration to the benefits of its citizens. So let's keep working and let's be pragmatic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lacroix. And I like the fact that you reminded everyone how important it is to create the framework needed to support our young people and our women on the continent. Thank you very much. I remind everyone that you are Managing Director Africa at One Point. So next we have our panel, but just before that, I'd like to introduce our first survey, which is coming up. All right, so we have, I'll just then remind you of the speakers that we'll have. Okay. Well, this is technology for you. So here is our poll. Can the AFCFTA be the African response to the economic crisis to come? Yes, absolutely. Yes, partly. Neutral, not at all. You have a few minutes to make your choices. And in a little while, I'll be giving you all your answers. So please, I encourage you to take full advantage of this poll. It's very interesting for us to know what you feel about that. So right now we'll move to our panel, and I now turn to our speakers, and they are today Mr. Maher Jarmakani, who is the CEO of Jagal, and Jagal is a diverse Nigerian conglomerate with investments in the oil and gas technology and FMCG sectors. Mr. Jarmakani is also a shareholder and board director of some of Nigeria's leading companies and an ambassador to the Africa CEO Network for Nigeria. Mr. Jarmakani, please be welcome. We are also in the company of Mr. Karim Tazi, who is administrator at Rich Bond, which is a company specializing in bedding, in the bedding industry. And they have several factories in different African countries, including in Côte d'Ivoire and Kenya. So it'd be very interesting to hear how we can compare different trade zones. And finally, we are with Mr. Nani Mungai. Mr. Mungai is senior partner at MMC Asafo, and he has notably advised on the largest IPO in East and Central Africa, which entailed the sale of 25% of the government of Kenya's shareholding in Safaricom. So, Mr. Tazi, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
And welcome to you as well, Mr. Mungai.
Thank you for.
Thank you. I now turn to you first, Mr. Jarmakani. So as far as the IFCFTA is concerned, what are these expectations, do you think, of the private sector and your expectations more specifically, please, Mr. Jarmakani?
Hi, good afternoon. I think for the private sector, biggest drivers for the Africa Free Trade Agreement is to drive down cost of production, cost of output, is to generate a more interest to trade within the continent. We have always a challenge on export and international trade because we find that production within Africa is a high cost production. When you look at trade within the European Union, about 60% of the trade is within member nations. And that's because they've created a supply chain that helps to drive growth within the members of the Union. While in Africa, we find that most of our sourcing is from outside the continent. And the reason why it's outside of the continent is because it is cheaper. And the reason why it is cheaper is because the global supply chain is more efficient and the cost of funds for production are cheaper internationally. And the infrastructure of moving goods within the Africa continent is most of the time more expensive than actually moving units, let's say, of containers of goods from outside of the continent into the continent. And it is something that we actually have a challenge on across the continent. For us, I mean, for myself, I'm very actually excited about this because creating this supply chain within the continent is going to be, I think, a big game changer for African companies.
So we've heard the Secretary General explain the reasons why this trade area has been postponed, but were you surprised to hear that it's been delayed?
No, I'm not very surprised. It is a challenging thing to put into the continent. It's also not just a legal matter, it's also a cultural change in promoting trade between African countries. And I think, you know, it's if the delay is a matter of 6 months, 1 year, I think we can live with that. I think getting it right, launching it correct way, and encouraging its members to start trading is the most important thing.
Thank you very much. And indeed, again, the Secretary General really made a point of saying that we need to get this AFCFTA right before we start. So thank you very much. I now turn to Mr. Nani. We've heard Mr. Jarmakani saying that it is indeed difficult to get a agreement among different countries, different cultures, and even within different trade zones. And I would like to ask you actually to even compare the various free trade zones that we already have in the continent. And very often people congratulate the ECA. And I wanted to ask you, what are the lessons that we can learn from the ECA and which this new intercontinental free trade could benefit from implementing when it is in full force?
So I think first to just deal with the question of what was outstanding. The most difficult piece in the negotiations is going to be the schedule of preferential tariffs, and sometimes people don't get a sense of what is at stake. Effectively, you're talking of about a minimum of 250 different negotiations, and it could go up to 400 different negotiations, because each country is entitled to negotiate separately with each country. So you have 54 countries, each of them negotiating their schedule of tariffs, because Kenya might not be comfortable opening up importation of sugar from South Africa, where the cost of production is very high, and it would impact on their own industry. So it was a very aggressive target, hoping that they had hoped to finish those negotiations by March. And those are not negotiations that you can have easily by video conference. You're talking about hundreds of people going through thousands of documents. So I think the reasons for the postponement was really because of COVID, because it's hard to finish that. Coming back to the East African community, the East African community has now been in force for 20 years. It came into force in 2000, and there's been tremendous progress in terms of the customs union. So we have a common external tariff vis-a-vis other countries. We have zero tariffs between ourselves. We have a single window for clearing, meaning that if your goods come into Mombasa and you are an importer in Burundi, you will fill one customs declaration form in Mombasa, and the Burundi officials are sitting in Mombasa to clear your goods, so that you don't have to then clear them through Uganda and again to Burundi. So that has been a very useful part of that. The other thing is we've had harmonization of taxes. We've also harmonized tax procedures, and we've also harmonized standards. We have agreed on 1,400 standards, and standards are one of the big non-tariff barriers that come in. What has been the big driver? I think it's been the commitment. There's been tremendous political commitment from the highest levels, from the heads of states, but also having the right people in the ministries of trade who are dedicated and are there year in, year out, irrespective of the changes in the regime, because you need people who are technical and committed. So I think it is possible, but it does require a lot of work and commitment.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Mr. Mungai, because indeed, we've pinpointed those areas which still need to be ironed out. And thank you very much for going more into detail about this. Now I turn to you, Mr. Tazi. You told the Financial Times last year in a profile on you that in your opinion, the AfCFTA will never happen. Do you still stand by your declaration? And does it mean that you were expecting, in fact, a postponement for whatever reason?
Yes, I'm not surprised at all. I think that COVID has been a very convenient answer to give, but I'm absolutely not surprised. I really have listened carefully to what Mr. Mungai has just said about how very difficult it is to implement a real free trade area, because you have to work on a lot of, because the level of the custom duties are not the main problem. It's all the non-tariff barriers and all the agreements that you need to have about a lot of matters like the standards, the rules of origin and everything. And I think that, well, for these to be achieved at the continental level is one thing, very complicated, and then the political will, and this is what I still have in mind, is that I don't think that the political will and the political commitment is very strong among the African heads of state to really implement the AfCFTA.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tazi. And you've had, I mentioned, you've invested in Kenya, you've invested in Côte d'Ivoire. What lessons can you learn from trading in two different trade zones?
Well, to make first the comparison between the West African Free Trade Zone and the East African Community, one of them is much less dysfunctional than the other. The East African Community works rather well. There is a certain ease of moving goods between the countries, whereas it's very difficult to export between Côte d'Ivoire and Burkina, or between Côte d'Ivoire and Mali, which are part of the same free trade zone. It's extremely difficult, and it's not a matter of custom duties. And the Secretary General gave a hint about all the non-tariff barriers that are used by the states to not implement free movement of goods. So to give you an example, when I have to ship some goods from Abidjan to Bamako, most of the times my truck spent more than 4 or 5 days waiting at the borders. And it's the same thing between Côte d'Ivoire and Burkina. Very difficult as well between Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. And you all know about what happened between Nigeria and Benin. And you all probably have in mind that only a year or 2 years ago, Morocco was a candidate to join the West African trade zone, and it was exactly the same story, We were on track, they had all signed everything, ratified everything, agreed on everything, and only 2 days before, we just learned that there was some resistance from private sector inside the countries, and that industrialists, both in Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, even Nigeria, expressed some concerns about competition coming from Moroccan firms, and at the last minute, it didn't happen. And I'm not surprised that the same thing happened for AFCFTA.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tazi. It's very good to have your insights and your experience there. So we have mentioned tariffications and other rules and regulations which we need to guarantee a prosperous AFCFTA. Now a little bit more on the topics of competition and custom duty with our next keynote speaker, Gomolemo Kekesi, who is director at Asafo and Lawtons. Mrs. Kekesi is a career competition law practitioner with an in-depth experience in competition laws on various African jurisdictions. Mrs. Kekesi, I leave the floor to you for your presentation.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. Afternoon, everyone. Certainly it's late evening here in South Africa. It is a pleasure to be with you today. I've observed the very laudable objective of the AFCFTA, which is essentially to create a single continent-wide market. This is certainly something that is unprecedented in Africa, but one that many of us had hoped and continue to hope will happen. In order to do this, you are essentially trying to enhance competition, and that is why competition law instruments becomes quite key in effecting the aims of the AFCFTA. And it comes as no surprise that the member states have already made provision to cooperate on competition policy. The competition policy is intended to be negotiated during phase 2, which I think originally was intended to happen next year in 2021 through a protocol on competition. But with COVID derailing things as it has, I suspect that there might be a further push out of that timeline. It is noteworthy that it hasn't really been specified exactly in respect of what areas of competition policy the member states will cooperate on, but it is noteworthy from the protocol on trade and services that member states have recognized that there are certain practices that restrict competition and thereby restrict trade across borders. And so there is a need to eliminate this restriction through the effective enforcement of competition policy. And the agreement also indicates that in the interim, the agreement will be governed by existing laws. And that is why this afternoon, for a second, we'll have a look at, well, what is in place in terms of competition law regulation across the continent. And I must emphasize that it is quite fragmented. And that is why at the heart of my presentation is that if this laudable aim is to be achieved, you really need convergence on competition policy and how it is enforced. And so what we have are national competition policies essentially enforced by different regulators. We also have the regional economic communities that have established competition law policy. And this policy essentially regulates cross-border activity, or what we'll call extraterritorial economic activity. But really, whether at a national level or a regional level, competition policy is intended to promote competition. And the reason why you would want to promote competition is that you want to ensure the efficient functioning of economies, so that you ensure that they operate as optimally as possible. You want to maximize consumer choice in terms of maximum price options, innovation, quality standards. And I think an aim that is aligned with what the free trade area across the continent is seeking to achieve is existing small and large, medium-sized entities should be encouraged to grow and have a legal environment that facilitates their growth, so that they will not only grow within national markets, but across the continent, and certainly be on par with other world operators. Just to zone in on what happens domestically. So we have approximately 54 countries across the continent, and at least less than half of them have their own domestic legislation. But really, since the early 90s, there's been growing momentum to pass competition legislation at a domestic level. And so even as we speak, there are new pieces of legislation that are coming on stream. Even though at a national level, there are nuances when you look at competition law, really the architecture of competition law enforcement is the same internationally. There are two broad areas. It's the transactional side. So for brownfield projects where you would be acquiring, merging, combining with other entities, there are requirements there which typically require you to pre-notify before you can even implement. There are filing fees, there are assessments about whether that transaction will be good or bad for the relevant market, and other sort of public interest considerations that can come into play there. Then there's the behavioral side. So just like the protocol on trade and services recognizes, there are certain behaviors by market participants that can restrict competition. So whether you're looking at unilateral conduct by dominant firms or monopolists, or multi-party conduct, in the form of competitors fixing prices, what we call cartels, or the relationship between suppliers, distributors, and customers, and whether there are exclusivities at play. Now, the complexity that comes in there is that the different domestic legislation and the enforcement of them are at different levels of maturity. And so you can have a more developed economy, let's for argument's sake, Kenya, where the regulator might be a little bit more mature, and they might have created safe harbors there that certain conduct falls below the radar of authorities, and they will let it happen. And that the purpose of doing that is to allow small to medium-sized entities to, say, cooperate in order to get maximum discounts and to promote their growth in the market. But in a smaller and less mature economy, that same conduct can be prohibited. And so if you're a firm operating in more than one country, you might find that one conduct is okay in one jurisdiction, but not so in another. To add a further complexity is that there are sector regulations, and sectors that are typically regulated across Africa is the telecoms, broadcasting, oil and gas. And here, some of the nuances include that there's competition regulation by the sector regulator. And so you see this sort of concurrence in the overlap between competition at a sector level and competition across economies that is regulated by a national competition agency. And so in order to streamline the sector regulation of competition and the national legislation, there are MOUs that are put in place to try and cooperate and ensure that firms aren't hit for the same conduct by sector regulators and national regulators on the other hand. Probably most pertinent for the Free Africa trade area for the continent are the regional economic communities. So many of them have established extraterritorial competition agencies. And There are probably about 5 that are live and operating, doing either mergers or both mergers and restrictive practices. And really, this has created a serious difficulty, certainly not just for lawyers, but more so for business, because you are essentially increasing the burden of doing, business in Africa by saying you need to look at the national laws that are different in a sense and multiple, and also you look at regional laws that are applied by different regional economic authorities or competition authorities specifically. And just to give you a practical example, I mean, if you are in 5 countries, it means you need to worry about, do I need to comply with the national legislations, or do I need to comply with the regional competition policies? Is it more than one regional competition policy that's at play that is affecting my business? You're looking at a conflict of decisions. So what if one regional body allows you to operate and another one puts conditions that essentially obstruct your ability to come on stream? And this is unlike the EU, where there are clear, certain, and predictable rules that ensure that the national policies do not come into conflict with the regional competition policy. So, if something hits the threshold of the European Competition Commission, the national authorities do not look at it. And similarly, if it's below that, that's when the national competition authorities can look at a particular conduct. And so at the key of my message is that we need conversions of the different competition policies, if you just go to the next slide, in order for us to achieve a truly free trade area. Otherwise, competition policies can scupper whatever efforts, even if trading starts, whenever it is contemplated now next year. Without conversions and harmonization of competition policies, you are creating serious business and increasing the cost of doing business within Africa. You've got 2 regional bodies that look at the eastern side, and that's COMESA and EAC, and although all of those have got sort of overlapping countries, and then you've got the western side, and then you've got a little bit on the southern African side. And SADC doesn't have a competition authority currently, but they certainly have ambitions to start enforcing competition law within the SADC region. And the closing point on the harmonization of competition policy for me is the cooperation that's contemplated under the protocol really has to focus and start with how do we converge and how do we streamline and harmonize competition policy. As a parting point, it did occur to me that if the aim of removing tariff barriers, including non-tariff barriers like laws, is to be achieved, and if the benefit of it is intended to be for Africa, that is a little bit of a problem, because as things currently stand, there are many locally registered firms that are actually owned by offshore companies. They compete side by side, locally owned, or what I'll call African owned entities. And so if you remove barriers, tariff barriers in particular, with the aim of improving and enhancing competitiveness of African countries, that's going to have a similar effect for internationally owned or foreign owned firms. And I can see an increase in their participation. I can see an increase in entry into Africa by foreign owned firms. So the challenge for me, for not just Mr. Wamkele Mene, but anybody else who's going to be enforcing this, is how do you ensure that the maximum benefits, the intended benefits, actually flow within Africa, but to Africans, for Africans? And I unfortunately don't have a ready answer for this, but it will be something that should be kept in mind, and I will be watching with interest. Thank you, Anne-Marie.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation, which I've followed as well with a lot of interest. And thank you for reminding us what is needed for this harmonization of competitive policy. Thank you very much, Mrs. Kekesi. And now to the result of our first poll, which you will see on the screen very, very shortly. So the question was, can the AfCFTA be the African response to the economic crisis to come? And quite mitigated there. Yes, partly, 55%. That's the most of your answers. Yes, absolutely, 34%. We still have 9% of neutral and 2% not at all. So it's fairly positive. And right now you'll see the next question for the second poll of the day. You'll see it in a second. Do you think that the AfCFTA will come into force in the next 12 months? very bluntly here, yes, no, no opinion. I very much look forward to see what you decide in a few minutes. But before that, I have one last question for our speakers here today, and that will be the same question for all three of you. And unfortunately, time is drawing to a close right now, so I'll ask you to be fairly rapid and constricted with your answers. So my question to all of you is, what are the determinant factors to guarantee the success of the AFCFTA in your opinion? And I'll start with you, Mr. Tazi, please.
So, well, I think that for free trade to succeed in Africa, it has not to be over ambitious. And I think that the priority should at least to build regional free trade areas before we can think of expanding it at the scale of the whole continent. This is the first thing. The second thing, I think, is to be able to rely on efficient, competent, and corruption-free customs administration, because, as you know, the rules of origin are extremely important, and free trade has to benefit to goods that have a lot of added value in Africa. And for this to be achieved, you need to have a competent and efficient custom administration, which is far to be the case for a lot of African countries. So I think it will take some time before we can achieve a continental-wide free trade agreement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tazi. And I'll turn to you, Mr. Jarmakani. What are the prerequisites, in your opinion?
I would agree with the ones that are already stated, and I would maybe just add to it a move by governments to put in more investment into infrastructure that links interstate trading. As I said, logistics is a big key factor in the movement of goods across the continent.
Thank you very much. And I'll ask the same question to you, finally, Mr. Mungai.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. Political commitment, I think, is critical, and the role of the Afro champions that has been suggested, I think, is absolutely critical. You need a committed group of people who are able to keep pushing the countries and are able to talk to the various heads of states and the ministers to push through things. The infrastructure piece is absolutely critical. If you look at the data now, the bulk of intra-Africa trade happens within the blocks and very little outside of the blocks. And for that, infrastructure is one big constraint.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I really appreciate how you were very concise in your answers there. So we are going to take a couple of questions from our participants, but before, I would like you to have a look at the result of our last and second poll. You'll see it in a second. All right, so do you think that the AFCFTA will come into force in the next 12 months? Well, look how close this is. So yes, 45%, no, 48%, no opinion, 7%. So we'll see that indeed there's still a lot of convincing to do there. Thank you very much. And now to some questions which have been asked. The first one comes from Kola Adehibige. For Africa trade facilitation, how do we differentiate goods imported from other continents without compromise as goods manufactured in Africa? That's a very interesting question. And Mr. Nani, would you like to reply to that?
Yes, that question is actually at the heart of any free trade area. And the criteria is the rules of origin. And that's why rules of origin are so critical. And they're very, very detailed in terms of how they describe what qualifies and what doesn't qualify. For example, some of the rules will say raw materials beyond a certain percentage coming from outside would then disqualify the goods. So it's the rules of origins, and they're very, very detailed, and it would not, I think, be appropriate to try and detail them. But that is what is at the heart of determining what qualifies, what doesn't qualify, the rules of origin.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And I'd like you to reply as well to this question from Fidel Diangone. Are there quotas provided for by types of goods eligible for trade among the African country members?
So part of the negotiations that are supposed to happen on the tariffs will be where those will be negotiated. So the tariff negotiations has classified products into three. Sensitive, meaning those that a country feels would affect their local industry, non-sensitive, and exclusion. And you are allowed to have different time frames within which you ease out. Just to give you an example, under COMESA, Kenya has consistently over the last 20 years been able to negotiate quotas for sugar because sugar into Kenya is very expensive. Production of sugar in Kenya is very expensive. So that's part of the negotiations in the tariffs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nani, for answering those questions there. I would like to thank all of you who have taken part to this wonderful and ever so interesting conversation. Unfortunately, we are at the end of our webinar. It's been incredibly interesting. We've had a chance to hear from the Secretary General of the AFCFTA and also from the private sector with you, Mr. Karim Tazi. Thank you very much. And also Mr. Maher Jarmakani. We've had the legal aspects explained by Nani Mungai. I would like to thank you very much, and Mrs. Kekesi as well. And also, we need to remember the presentation of Mr. Thierry Lacroix. I encourage you all to go to the Africa CEO Forum website, where you'll see the full agenda of the digital events to come. The next one will be held on June the 25th, and you'll be able to see all the details of that. As I said at the top of our webinar, your opinion is ever so important to us, and you will be receiving very shortly in your email a questionnaire, and please fill it in to let us know what you have thought about this webinar. Also, this discussion will be very soon available on replay on the Africa CEO Forum's website, and of course I invite you to share it all with your contacts. My name is Anne-Marie Diaz-Borges. It has been a pleasure to be with you today on this discussion on what is at stake for the African Continental Free Trade Area. I thank you all, and I wish you a good day. Bye.